is called Voices of Protest. Voices of Protest. You'll see the way that it fits perfectly with the last chapter's discussion. The first slide is a picture. What this is a picture of the windows outside the NAACP offices in New York. So in this time period that we're thinking about, this is the North now, so think about how you're going to get a great migration, you're going to get a concentration of African Americans in northern cities, places like Harlem. The NAACP actually finds its headquarters in New York, and you would see this after a lynching happened anywhere in the U.S., the NAACP would put the flag out and say somebody got lynched yesterday, so that everybody in New York basically would know, okay, this is still a problem, it's still going on. Just because it happened 1,000 miles away in Mississippi means that it doesn't mean that it's not important anymore. The NAACP would kind of pick up the mantle of anti-lynching activism that Ida Wells really kind of begins. Right? She doesn't get enough credit, but the NAACP would continue this work for decades, really. And in fact, NAACP would push to get anti-lynching laws passed through Congress. Many, many years they keep proposing laws to be passed to outlaw lynching. The maybe surprising fact is that those laws never passed. Those laws always got defeated. One in particular, they called it the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill, so you read about that, D-Y-E-R. They propose this bill and it never gets passed because there's such power, and especially Southern congressmen, they're not able to get it passed. But they would continue to push for this activism and let everybody know that lynching was a national problem, not just a Southern problem. So a lot of Chapter 15 talks about the NAACP as an example of a new Negro organization, right, deciding how they were going to respond to this new Negro time period, how they were going to try to challenge stereotypes of the old Negro and whatnot. This is also a useful organization for us because next time we want to talk about a different kind of new Negro response, which is going to be the response of Marcus Garvey. It's very different in many ways from what the NAACP would put out there. Again, both of them see themselves as new Negro organizations, but they're going to have very different responses, very different strategies, tactics to try to deal with what they saw as the key problems. The NAACP, though, is hugely important. It's founded in 1909. Du Bois is one of the founders. He's actually one of the few African Americans in a leadership position. It's an interracial organization from the beginning. But they're going to remain important throughout the century and still to this day in many cases. So The Crisis is the magazine that Du Bois was editor of. It was the organ, the mouthpiece for the NAACP. NAACP also, we'll talk more about this when we get closer to the Civil Rights era. NAACP is going to really pioneer the use of the courts, the use of the law to try to deal with Jim Crow segregation. So they really kind of pioneered the strategy that you can use American democracy, America's ideals about equality and whatnot to overcome racism. Seems like that wouldn't work because, the society was a Jim Crow society. But they're saying, look, the laws are on the books, some of them. We can use them to kind of make people behave the way they should behave. It's going to take a long time for that to be accomplished. But ultimately, it will be accomplished. For example, the best case is probably the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case. The NAACP advocates that case, which overturns Plessy versus Ferguson from 60 years earlier. So they're able to use the courts to get rid of old laws. We'll talk more about that when we get closer to the 60s. But despite some of the successes in this time period for the NAACP and for the time period generally, this time period generally is known as the Progressive Era. Progressive Era. Now that had to do with really a definition of activism. A lot of people in this country, in this period, black, white, and other, feel like there's something wrong with this society. Feel like there's something wrong with this society and that society needs to be improved, changed for the better. They call themselves progressives. So when you read about this in the chapter, and they call these various people progressives, basically what they're saying is, if you look at the term, they had ideas about how progress is not all good. I think about Booker T. Washington early on, right? He's saying, get a job, get this and that, work in a factory, and feed your family, right? Get on the train of progress, and we African Americans will be okay. Well, a lot of folks say, well, maybe that's not always true. Because if you think about the time period, especially in the north, you have a number of cities that are growing in population, right? Cities like New York that are getting huge, industries in the north, big factories developing in the north, and there are certain problems associated with that type of progress, especially industrial progress, urban problems. I'll give you a couple of examples. Cities, just cities generally. We think of cities as being, pretty good places for the most part, right? You want to get away from the farm, get to the city. Yet cities in this time period were rough places. Cities were concentrations of people in small areas. Remember, if you lived on a farm, there might be 10 of you on a big 20-acre farm. Maybe your nearest neighbor's 5 miles away. You're not worried about stuff like pollution. Right? You move to a city, all of a sudden you live in Harlem, New York. You just migrated, so you probably don't have a lot of money. The only place you can afford is in a community with folks like you, probably a slum. And this is true of African Americans migrating. It's mostly true of Southern and Eastern Europeans migrating. You had whole neighborhoods that were Irish or Italian or whatever. Hopefully you find a room and maybe you share that room with 10 other people. But think about what cities might look like. Right? There's a lot of writing on this time period how dangerous and difficult city life was. No indoor plumbing, poor heat, ventilation, whole bunch of people living on top of each other essentially. You ever heard the phrase, not a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of? That comes out of this era of the cities. You didn't have indoor plumbing, so you had a pot that folks used for that purpose. What did you do with the pot when it was done? There was no flush. Threw it out the window. Right, so you have these big major buildings. Just toss it out the window into the street, gutter area. Now imagine you're walking by a tenement, hopefully not with your mouth open, and somebody drops something down on you. There's all kind of disease that gets spread, poor water supplies. These are rough places. Now people live there because they're so close to these higher paying jobs. But for the most part, cities are dirty, dangerous places. And a lot of folks say, well, there's a problem with that. There are a lot of progressive folks that say, we got to do something about this. So we need to make factories safer, right? Folks are getting their arms cut off in the factory. There is no health insurance. You just out of luck. Right? So the folks start trying to make factories safer, certain standards, try to make tenements safer, help immigrants that are coming in, the settlement house movement, all these. So this is, countrywide. In addition, you have specific African American progressives, people like Washington and Du Bois. They're saying that, yeah, cities are a problem, but also race is a problem. So one of their progressive goals might be, how do we deal with the race problem? So all these things are happening at the same time. And you see the whole era gets called the progressive era. Progressive era. It really is about how people are responding to the problems of progress. How they're responding to the problems of progress. So the NAACP, in a sense, believes that black people are benefiting from all these progressive things. So you have people making factories safer, which is good for workers, yet black people aren't necessarily allowed those factory jobs. So Du Bois and Washington are saying, well, we're not really benefiting in the same way. The NAACP is saying we're not really benefiting in the same way from some of those progressive goals. We talked a bit already about the 1912 election. We were talking about Woodrow Wilson last time. Remember, Woodrow Wilson is going to be president in 1912. He wins again in 1916, as I said last time, in part by keeping the U.S. out of the war. The NAACP and others, though, and Du Bois especially, developed major problems with Woodrow Wilson. The African American community is going to develop major problems with Woodrow Wilson, partly because he had made a number of promises to the African American community. He had made all these promises about how he's going to treat them fairly and do these things, and many people see him as not living up to those promises. We talked about that a bit in terms of the war, but I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is when he shows Birth of a Nation in the White House. Remember, it's seen as this very racist film glorifying the KKK and how Reconstruction was a horrible thing. He shows it in the White House and says, this is great, it's the greatest movie ever. The NAACP would protest the showing of that movie with a march. So this is one of the ways that he's seen as not being so friendly for African Americans. Washington, D.C. itself was a pretty good place for African Americans to come. A lot of folks migrate to Washington, D.C. beginning around the 1880s because you could get a good government job. You could work down near the Capitol and get a pretty good job as an African American person as early as the 1880s and 1890s. But Wilson comes in 1912 and actually would bring Jim Crow to civil service. So a lot of African Americans actually lose their jobs under him, people that had been in those jobs for years, because he gives in to pressure, basically. Says you have to segregate D.C. So a lot of folks have problems with Wilson. Same thing, and coming out of the war, there's going to be some disappointment with Wilson as well. African Americans are going to protest this. There's always going to be a reaction. We talk so much about the negative, but always think about the fact that folks do respond to this, including the NAACP, including the larger African American community, when they respond to Birth of a Nation, for example, when they protested in a number of ways. Haiti is occupied under Wilson, so again, a lot of folks see that as an American attack on this symbol of black freedom, right? This second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, this first black republic that gets occupied by American troops around 1915. The chapter goes into the Immunity Conference and these other people that are going to be pushing for rights, trying to abolish lynching and such. We don't need to necessarily talk about all that. This is a picture of some of the men and women, black and white, usually, that are pushing for African Americans. We talked about how the Klan resurges in this period, right? Some say directly as a result of Birth of a Nation that glorifies the Klan. The Klan is reborn in 1915 after kind of being largely disappeared for a while. The Klan is reborn in the North, reborn in Indiana. So not Mississippi, but Indiana. And it's going to have a couple of million members pretty quickly. So when you think about this time period and what's going on, this is significant. A lot of folks are making connections now between some of the controversial laws proposed in Indiana and its history. I heard on the radio yesterday, several folks bring up this point, but the Klan was reborn there. It's not like it's all progressive. It's interesting to think about the history. And even some contemporary debates, which we'll talk more about later. Race riots. Chapter talks a lot more about race riots. We've already, touched on these subjects in relation to World War I, about how particularly after the war, going abroad to fight for democracy, then you come home and get lynched. Right? Come home and find yourself attacked in race riots, particularly in northern race riots. Right? We've talked a lot about lynching as a southern thing, but a lot of these race riots are in big northern cities. Think about this in relation to this Great Migration. You've got thousands of people in southern cities. Some of them are going north for work, but some of these war jobs that pay better. A lot of them are going north fleeing from lynching. Like, you know what, my cousin got lynched, I'm not staying in Mississippi another day. We're going to read some letters from people that talk about that. I'm out. I'm going. Say you go from Mississippi to Chicago, right, one of the major destinations during the Great Migration. But then, in the red summer of 1919, there are 26 race riots, including in Chicago, including in New York. Probably the worst one in Chicago. So a lot of folks that migrate are like, why did we leave? There was one or two people that got lynched that we knew. Here, hundreds of people are getting attacked. Is it any better? So part of what you'll be thinking about with this Great Migration is it a positive or a negative thing, ultimately? I'll get to that in a second. The Chicago race riot is really important, really major tipping point, because it happens in a big city, it happens in the north. What happens specifically with Chicago? This gives you some idea about Jim Crow and how random some things could be, how some of these unwritten rules might play into this. 1919, Chicago race riot. Again, it's considered the most serious race riot. It started with a drowning. Basically what happens, says a black man at Lake Michigan Beach. Really, it's a young person, a kid. What happens is there is an invisible color line at the beach. There's a black and white section at the beach. Now, where that line is, it's not a physical line. You can draw with a marker, right? But there's a line where, okay, black folks stay over there, white folks stay over there on the beach. This line goes all the way out into the water. So there is an invisible line in the ocean that black people are not supposed to cross. Well, what happens? Current, got some black kids out there playing. Current causes them to drift over the line. How do people respond to that? White kids start throwing rocks at the black kids. Black kids out in the water, they cross the line and start throwing rocks at them. Black kid gets hit in the head, unconscious, and drowns. Now, why is he killed? Because he supposedly crossed the line of Jim Crow. He supposedly crossed this color line. Now, what's interesting is that, again, now we're in a period of the new Negro, right? Usually, before you had attacks on African Americans, and really African Americans kind of had to, for the most part, take it. I try to, stay safe. In a lot of these northern cities, what you're starting to see is that black people would respond. We saw this with the Houston riot in 1917. Remember there was a police brutality case against one of the black soldiers. He goes back to the base, gets all the other soldiers, and they go to the police station. They're like, "What's up? We have guns too." They shoot 5 cops. They're saying, look, we're not going to respond the way that the old Negro responded. Again, whether you agree or disagree with that response, it's a very different response than you would see earlier on. Folks are fighting, and they're shootouts, essentially. Now, blacks are outnumbered, and a lot of blacks are going to die as a result of this. Chicago is without law and order, no police around for 13 days or so. It's kind of open season on black folks. Many of them would respond and defend themselves. But this is a different response this kind of new Negro is going to give than the old Negro might have given. So keep all this in mind. It's a different response in part because they're in urban areas now. If you were in Mississippi and your nearest neighbor, your nearest black neighbor is 20 miles away, it's easier to lynch you. When you get into trouble, you get lynched. You don't have time to even call your neighbor for help. But if you go to the Ida B. Wells projects in Chicago, somebody attacks this building with 1,000 black people in it, they might get shot. This is essentially a different situation in part because of the Great Migration. So it's interesting that you see these riots in a number of cities, both northern and southern cities, some of which you've probably heard of. There are some key ones. 1921, I believe it is, Tulsa, Oklahoma. There are race riots where the black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma gets attacked, what they call Black Wall Street at the time. If any of you listen to the rapper The Game, he talks about Black Wall Street. That was a historic thing. There was a strong middle-class community in Tulsa in a certain area that they called Black Wall Street. And when tensions rise, the white community attacked and burned down Black Wall Street to kind of attack this idea that black success and upper-class, progress, right? It's interesting to think about that significance. Or Rosewood. There was a movie made about Rosewood, a lady that's in Scandal now is in this movie Rosewood. It was about a race riot, lynchings that happened in Rosewood, Florida, which was an all-black town in the 1920s. So this is a difficult period in a lot of ways. Think about how some things have changed and some things have remained the same. Tulsa, mentioned there, Rosewood, Detroit, right? These are all areas that are developing stronger black populations. Lynchings continue. We don't need to talk any more about that. We're become experts on that process now. I told you also how the NAACP is going to be seen as the major organization fighting lynching at this point. They're going to continue to do so for a number of decades. Legal efforts. I told you how the NAACP is really going to pioneer a strategy of what we'll call later legalism, trying to use the courts to defeat Jim Crow. There's some examples of that. This takes us to the Great Migration. This takes us to this idea of the Great Migration. Now, this topic of the Great Migration comes up in chapter 14 and here in 15. A couple of things I want to point out about this migration, and then I want to read quickly through the handout I gave you last time on this Great Migration project. This migration is huge. It's a huge tipping point in American and African American history. It's going to change the way Southern societies look. Actually, let me take that back. It's going to change